It all starts with a question. Are tattoos part of the human record? My name is Peter, and this is Stacks and Facts. Viewer advisory. This video contains some sensitive material, including the filmed process of tattooing with real ink and needles and maybe some blood too, but mostly no blood. If this isn't your cup of tea, feel free to minimize the video and pretend it's a podcast. It also discusses the Holocaust, but I haven't included any images of a graphic nature from that time included, in case there are children in the audience. So, that's that. This video will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In North America, it's not hard to find people with tattoos. A 2015 poll found that nearly 3 in 10 Americans have at least one somewhere on their body, and that number goes up the younger you are, with nearly half of everyone aged 18 to 35 having been inked. Because of this, you're probably familiar with some of the more common tattoos out there. Sailor Jerry-style pinup girls, a flaming heart with mom across it, or sailors with tattoos of anchors or swallows, each of which have interesting histories in their own rights. But while tattooing in the United States is enjoying major popularity right now, it's important to note that tattooing is neither just an American phenomenon, nor is it even a modern invention. Tattoos have been a form of the human record for literally millennia, and ancient examples have spanned the globe. The Smithsonian reported in March of this year, 2018 for those of you in the distant future, that after a pair of mummies at the British Museum were re-examined, tattoos of animals on the male and S-shaped objects on the female were found on their arms and shoulders. It's suspected that the animals on the male represented virility, because of course they did, while the S-shapes, which are suspected to be staves or some other objects connected with ceremony, represent power or ritual. These people were alive between 5,000 and 5,300 years ago, making them contenders for the oldest tattooed mummies found. Another example is that of a mustache tattooed on the mummified remains of a person found in Chile, likely coming from prehistoric Chinchorro culture. For a while, this was believed to be the oldest example of a tattoo found at a whopping 6,000 years old, but by 2015, that estimate was corrected to around 3,800 years old. Rounding errors, I tell ya. And finally, we have tattoos that come from the Alps on the border of Italy and Austria, those on 5,300-year-old Ötzi the Iceman. Our friend Ötzi has lines tattooed all over their body, but what's interesting about these tattoos, though, is that their locations correspond with places where Ötzi had joint problems: the ankles, knees, along the spine, a wrist, and an elbow. Because of this, it's thought that perhaps the tattoos were used as a form of treatment for these illnesses, or as guides for some other treatment like acupuncture. And I think this is a great opportunity to talk about tattooing for medical reasons. This is Oberon Wolf, or Aubrey, a tattoo artist here in Vancouver, and they did my tattoo. They specialize in using tattooing to help people overcome traumas they've experienced, sometimes using them to transform scars from a painful past into something beautiful and empowering. My tattoo is not that kind of tattoo, not exactly anyways, but I think it's important to support folks whose personal values align with my own. Plus, they're hella queer, which, let's be honest, is my kind of people. So here's some of what they had to say about how they got started and what tattooing means to them.
I was starting to build a community of people that were trans and a community of people that had experienced breast cancer along the same time, and began to imagine what it could look like to use skin pigments to feminize somebody more or masculine. Like, I was very much inspired by drag communities where you can put like a little bit of contouring on the face or on the body and it drastically changes the illusion. And so that was actually what first birthed that kind of idea, was around easing dysphoria for people that might not be able to access surgeries for whatever reason. But it would be years from that point until when I actually had the opportunity to learn medical tattooing and micropigmentation, but that always kind of lodged in the back of my head. Also, I have my own self-injury scars that I used to get harassed about in public service all the time. So when I got my own sleeve and felt my life transform in terms of public attention and self-perception, that just kind of cemented us like this is a thing. We can do something with this.
For sure.
But there's a person that I tattooed who had open heart surgery when she was quite young, and she felt very self-conscious, never wore anything revealing at all. The scar was quite large, probably almost about an inch in width, several inches in length. And in one session, we gave her a beautiful deer rose chest cover-up piece, and she sent me this awesome message a handful of months later being like, this one thing has changed me so much. Like, I just look in the mirror and think I'm so cute, and I wear things I never would have worn, and I feel myself changing. And I was like, this is so amazing. Because for me, I find it's usually not an immediate impact. It usually takes months or years for people to like see how much has shifted for them.
Yeah. Is that not just so great? Art as therapy is nothing new, but it feels so good to hear someone talk about how they can use their talents to help others, especially when it means helping others heal. So, if you find yourself in Vancouver, first of all, look me up. But also, if you want a tattoo from someone with those kinds of values, hit Aubrey up. Their contact info is in the doobly-doo. Thanks, Obs. Now, it would be wrong of me to talk about tattooing without also mentioning the role of tattoos in many of the indigenous cultures across Polynesia. The word tattoo itself is a loan word from the Samoan word tatau, the exact meaning of which is complex, as Professor Albert Wendt explains, link in the doobly-doo, but part of it means to strike. This calls back to how tattooing was traditionally performed among Polynesian cultures. The tattooer would dip a sharp needle-like object into an ink, place it on a person's body, and then strike the tool holding the ink to drive it into the skin. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, taamoko is similar to tatau, but uses a chisel instead of a needle. Tatau and taamoko are really important to Samoan and Maori people because they're a way to preserve and convey information not just about the individual, but about the people and the culture that the individual belongs to. Their very distinctive designs can indicate status, belonging, and identity, each of which people across Polynesia have had to fight to maintain as they struggle against colonialism and its lasting harmful legacy amongst indigenous societies. Nowadays, tatau, taamoko, and other tattooing practices are a way for Maori, Samoan, and other people across Polynesia to own and take pride in who they are and where they come from. I've put a bunch of links to some recommended readings in the description that discuss tatau and taamoko's history and modern developments, so go have a look. It's super interesting. Tatau and taamoko have been around for a very long time, and in the past few decades they've become, for some people, a symbol of national identity or cultural heritage in the modern world. A way to broadcast to the world, this is who I am, and this is where I come from. In that way, they serve as highly visible metadata. They tell you a thing about a person that the person wants to put out there. But sometimes tattoos aren't voluntary. An example of this comes from just outside of a little town in southern Poland called Oswiecim, the Auschwitz concentration camp complex. Starting in May of 1940, people who were sent to Auschwitz were assigned serial numbers as a way to keep track of them. Originally, these numbers were sewn onto clothing. This identified them as suitable for work, and thus, in the eyes of the state, worth keeping records about. However, people who were deemed unsuitable for work never got serial numbers, as they were sent directly to the gas chambers and murdered. The overwhelming majority of those murdered on arrival to Auschwitz were Jews, and the overwhelming majority of those who were sent to Auschwitz never left. Approximately 1.1 million out of the 1.3 million people who entered died there from 1941 to 1945, from gassing, starvation, disease, medical experimentation, being shot, or a handful of other causes. But I want to be very clear here. How they died does not take away from the fact that they were all murdered. It was this outrageous death rate that eventually led to prisoners being tattooed during intake. The harsh truth is that the people who ran the camp, and it was people who did these horrible things, make no mistake, not monsters or animals, but people, they wanted to make sure that their records were accurate. This was hard to do because after prisoners were murdered, their bodies were stripped of the clothing that bore these serial numbers. So in 1941, Auschwitz personnel began tattooing prisoners, first on their left upper chest, and then eventually on their left forearms. Aside from being individually assigned, each number was one in a specific series, depending on how that person was categorized. The pattern of digits assigned to Hungarian Jews was different from the pattern assigned to Roma prisoners. The pattern assigned to women was different from the pattern assigned to men. And the numbers were assigned in sequence. The higher the number, the later an individual arrived. In all, more than 400,000 serial numbers were issued. But again, that's out of the 1.3 million people who passed through Auschwitz's gates. Nearly 1 million people, men, women, children, the sick, the elderly, were, in the eyes of the SS officers, not worth the ink and paper it would cost to keep track of them. But we know these people existed, and that they were murdered. Train schedules, deportation data, written testimonies, and first-hand accounts by both prisoners and the people who work there all back this up, in spite of what a small but vocal minority might want us to believe. And so I think we have a responsibility to remember them, who they were, why they died, and how the world got to a point where that was even possible. It's easy to say that it could never happen again, but couldn't it? If we aren't careful, it can, and it will. We in the information professions also have a responsibility to recognize that how we go about doing our jobs can either support or resist systems that cause harm to others. The people who ran Auschwitz weren't just soldiers. They were secretaries, accountants, record keepers, doctors, and while it can be hard to imagine what good a single person can do against a greater power, it's important to remember that individuals are ultimately the only ones who do anything. What the individual chooses to do is ultimately up to them, and what informs those decisions is in part the information they have access to, and in part what their own values are. Someone very important to me once said that fame is a 4-letter word, and like tape or Zoom or face or pain or life or love, what ultimately matters is what we do with it. This person cared deeply about others and felt very strongly about the role that folks in media had to play in fulfilling the needs of those who consumed the media they produced. And so when he was a few years older than I am now, he started making a television show because he wanted to make sure that children had something on TV, a new media at the time, that provided them with value and substance. He kept at it for over 30 years, and in that time he taught children and the adults who cared for them the inherent worth that each of them had, and reminded them that they were complex beings with big feelings, and that was more than okay, it was important. He really tried to get across the idea that it was important to recognize your agency over your feelings, that you can control what you ultimately do with that mad that you feel. You can decide whether your anger or fear or even curiosity is destructive or constructive. And I think that that's really important, which brings us to my tattoo. By now, you might be able to tell that it's a tattoo of a trolley, and if you know me, you might be able to guess that I was talking about Fred Rogers, host of the TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and subject of the most excellent documentary that just came out, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Oh, and before I go on, I just want to take this opportunity to clarify that, contrary to rumors, Mr. Rogers was never in the military and did not wear sweaters to cover up full arm sleeve tattoos. Sorry if I just burst any bubbles, but it's just not true. His show had a trolley that would go between the real world and the land of make-believe, and since it's such an iconic piece of the show, I thought it would be a good way to, enshrine the values that Mr. Rogers was trying to get across. I got the tattoo because at some level, I want to broadcast my values to those I meet, and also to remind myself that I'm no exception. A thing that started happening since getting the tattoo, and that I didn't expect but I'm glad about, is that it's ended up serving as a kind of check on my own attitudes and behavior. It seems like it's easy these days to get wound up when we're talking with others online, and it's easy to forget that in spite of how technology changes our perceptions of others, the overwhelming majority of people are not so different from us. The internet has done a real number on how responsible we feel to be kind to each other, or give each other the benefit of the doubt. This feels pretty intuitive from skimming over most comment sections, or like all of Twitter, but research has started coming in that provides empirical evidence backing it up. We treat people worse on the internet. I worry, given recent events around the world, about how much of that bleeds into our interactions with others offline. And try as I might, I have not been an exception. But now, with this visual reminder a foot from my keyboard whenever I'm at it, I stop myself more often. I ask myself, what am I doing with this mad that I feel? Sometimes I'll end up being kinder with my words, and sometimes, because that's not always easy, I walk away. And that's okay, because I leave a little piece of myself behind every time I meet someone, online or off, and I feel like I owe it to myself and to others to make sure that it's good for them and for me. Now that I have this tattoo, it tells me not just about who I am or what I care about, but it'll serve as a reminder to future me about where I've been. So I'd like to offer my thanks to Randy Willier for his permission to use his rendition of the trolley, which I found as the cover art on a little book of quotes called, very appropriately, Life's Journeys According to Mr. Rogers. Now, because this is my first tattoo, I wanted to talk to someone whose tattoos have a little bit more history, so I emailed my friend Kim. Kim is a librarian in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and she sent me some photos of her tattoos along with what they mean to her. Here are just a few of them, along with how she described them. This one is a Japanese aesthetic inspired by my love of Japan and travel to Japan. My ancestry is Nordic Maori, thus a strong link to the sea. This one is a girl wearing goggles about to take flight. Goggles symbolize adventure for me, and this tattoo represents the end of a significant relationship. This one's based on the work of Melbourne street artist Caffeine, whose work I absolutely adore. She uses her practice to take art to slums and build capacity in communities. My obsession with Bowie and Camilla de Rico meant that it was inevitable that I would get an astronaut one day. I think that it's great that each of these can tell you a little bit about Kim, where she comes from, what she cares about, and that you wouldn't necessarily know the details without asking her. And I think that's the point that I want to close on, that as great as tattoos are, they're no substitute for actually getting to know someone. While we might make a snap judgment about someone based on how many tattoos a person has, or what the tattoos are of, or even where they are on a person's body, it's a lot more humanizing to let the tattoo help you imagine someone as a complex human being. Not every tattoo has an elaborate story behind it, but at the very least, it relates to a very specific time and place for that person who has it. So maybe use that little piece of human metadata to start a conversation. But hey, that's just an idea. Now, what I'd like to know is what you think of this idea of tattoos as metadata. Let me know in the comments below. And if you have tattoos, I would just dig it if you took a photo of it and sent that to me in a tweet with maybe a description of what it means to you. If you like this video, definitely share it with your friends. And if you like what I do more generally and you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and do that. There's a subscribe button down there, I think, somewhere. And right next to it, there's a little bell. And if you click that bell, you'll get notifications whenever I release a new video. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, don't forget to ask questions. Okay, bye.